Tonight we're jumping into the hard, scary, and ugly parts of growing up. You probably imagine red cheeks and sometime resting at home. But the truth for thousands of years was a dangerous risk taken in dark bedrooms. The fact is, many people listening today wouldn't have made it through their own young years. So before you settle in, take a second to hit like and subscribe, but only if you really like what I make here. Also, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to learn who's here from different parts of the world. Now, turn down the lights and let's begin tonight's story together. Our tale doesn't start with a sick child's temperature or with the light pink glow of spots showing up behind the ears. It doesn't start in a baby's room or a playground or even with a person at all. It starts much earlier in the long, slow history of virus changes with a different creature and a different sickness. It starts with cows. Picture huge, slow-moving groups of aurochs, the hairy, powerful relatives of our modern cattle, wandering across the giant grasslands of Eurasia. And inside their blood, a morbillivirus was quietly doing its work. A terrible germ we would later name rinderpest, the cattle sickness. For thousands of years, this virus and its cow hosts lived in a state of terrible balance. Rinderpest was frighteningly powerful, a shadow that could move through a herd and leave behind a path of death. But it was a disease of the grasslands, of the wilderness. It belonged to the world of animals. That all started to change around 10,000 years ago, with a huge shift in how humans lived. We call it the Neolithic Revolution. It sounds pretty fancy, but on the ground it was a slow, messy, and life-changing process. We stopped running after our food and started to grow it. We cut down forests, planted crops, and most importantly, we brought the animals away from the wild. We built barriers and pens. We tamed goats, sheep, and pigs, and we controlled the aurochs, raising them over many lifetimes into the calmer creatures we call cattle. We started to live with them side by side. We used their water. We breathed the dust from their homes. We slept close to their heat. We brought them inside the circle of our world. And by doing this, we accidentally invited their sicknesses to join us. For a virus, this was a chance of huge importance. Viruses aren't evil. They're simply copiers looking for new places. The jump from one type of creature to another, a zoonotic leap, is a hard evolutionary challenge. The virus must find a way to stick onto the cells of a new host, to take over their systems, and to copy itself successfully. For thousands of years, the rinderpest virus likely made countless failed tries to cross the species wall. An unlucky herder breathing in the wrong droplet from a sick cow might have gotten sick with a strange dead-end fever. His body would have been a biological dead end. The virus could enter, but it couldn't leave effectively enough to spread to another human. It was a failed try. But evolution is a numbers game, a tale of testing and mistakes played out over huge time periods. And humanity was about to change the chances dramatically. The farming revolution didn't just give us tamed animals. It gave us extra food, and extra food allowed for something completely new on the planet, the city. In the Fertile Crescent along the sides of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, settlements like Uruk and Ur began to grow. For the first time, tens of thousands of people were living together in tight, permanent groups. These were walled cities, mazes of mud brick houses, packed marketplaces, and basic waste systems. They were a paradise for germs, a sea of warm bodies, all breathing the same air, drinking from the same water sources. Sometime around the 5th century BC, perhaps in one of these busy Mesopotamian cities, the experiment finally worked. A version of the rinderpest virus changed, a tiny random change in its genetic instructions, perhaps to one of the proteins on its outer shell, allowed it to not only infect a human, but to multiply within human breathing tissues so much that it could burst out in a cough or a sneeze, a cloud of virus particles ready to find the next host. This was the birth of measles, the molecular clock. A method scientists use to trace the evolutionary past of viruses points to this time period, a time when human civilization had finally reached a critical size. This new human virus had a specific list of needs. It is an organism of crowds. To survive, the measles virus needs a constant, unbroken supply of new, vulnerable hosts. Once a person gets infected and gets better, they have a strong, lifelong protection. They're taken away from the group of possible victims. The virus cannot return to them. Therefore, in a small, isolated tribe of a few hundred people, a measles outbreak would be a fierce, self-stopping event. It would burn through the group, infecting almost everyone. The few who survived would be protected. The virus, having run out of fuel, would then disappear completely. Its family line ended in that community. It could only return if brought back from the outside. For measles to become endemic, a permanent smouldering feature of human life, it needs a population large enough to guarantee a steady supply of new hosts. That supply comes from babies. It needs a city or a network of connected cities with a population of at least 250,000 to 500,000 people, a birth rate high enough to constantly refresh the supply of unprotected children. And so, as the great cities of ancient times grew, Babylon, then Athens, then Rome, the measles virus settled in for the long stay. It had found its natural home not in the grasslands, but in the crowded nurseries and streets of human civilization. It became a childhood disease, a rite of passage. It became a seasonal hunter, stalking the winter months when people were crowded inside. It was a tax on life, paid almost only by the very young. For an ancient Roman, the idea of a childhood free from measles would have been as strange as a world without seasons. The virus had woven itself into the fabric of population numbers. Every year, a new group of babies would be born, and every few years, an epidemic wave would sweep through, taking a terrible portion of them. The survivors would carry the memory in their immune systems, and the cycle would continue. For centuries, this rhythm of life and death was simply a fact of the world. The Red Plague, as it was sometimes called, was a familiar shadow, but it was a nameless one, often mixed up with its far more scary cousin, a killer that left its survivors permanently marked and disfigured. It was just one of the fevers, one of the rashes. It would take a mind of unique brilliance in a city of unmatched learning to finally step into the medical chaos, to watch with a clear and steady eye, and to give this ancient ghost its own distinct identity. We travel now forward through time, from the smoky beginnings of the virus in ancient times to the bright intellectual world of the 9th century. We find ourselves in Baghdad, the shining circular heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. This is not the Baghdad of modern news, but a city of 1 million people, the largest in the world, a metropolis of libraries, observatories, and public hospitals, a place where scholars translated the works of Galen and Hippocrates from Greek into Arabic, debating and refining the medical knowledge of the ancient world. In this city, the pursuit of knowledge was a respected art, and at its very top was a physician of amazing genius. His name was Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, known to the medieval Latin West, who would later build upon his work simply as Rhazes. Rhazes was a polymath, a philosopher, an alchemist, and above all, a clinician of the highest order. He was the chief physician of the Great Bimaristan, the central hospital of Baghdad, a remarkably advanced institution with specialized wards and a commitment to rational evidence-based care. He was a man who believed in what he could see, touch, and carefully record. He rejected superstition and blind following of ancient authority. His guiding principle was observation. He would spend hours at the bedsides of his patients, noting every detail of their sicknesses with a scientist's precision and a poet's descriptive power. And it was in the fever wards of Baghdad that Rhazes faced a medical puzzle that had confused physicians for centuries: the chaotic jumble of eruptive fevers. In his time, any disease that produced a rash was often lumped together under a general diagnosis, a fog of confusion that prevented any real understanding or effective treatment. The most feared of these was smallpox al-Judari, but Rhazes in his careful daily rounds noticed something. He saw that not all the rashes were the same. Some patients, particularly children, came in with a different kind of illness. It was serious, yes, but it followed a different path. He decided to document it, to create a definitive guide that would separate one from the other. The result was a medical masterwork, a slim but monumentally important volume titled Kitab fi al-Jadari wa al-Hasba, the book on smallpox and measles. For the very first time in medical history, measles, al-Hasba, was formally and scientifically separated from smallpox. It was no longer a variant, a milder form, or a confusing mimic. It was its own disease with its own character, its own signs, and its own outlook. This was not a lucky guess. It was the product of methodical, careful scientific investigation. Reading Rhazes' descriptions today is a startling experience. His clarity and precision bridge the 11 centuries that separate us. He describes the prodrome, the beginning phase of the illness, with an accuracy that any modern medical student would recognize. He notes the uneasiness and nausea and the anxiety and heaviness of the whole body. He describes the high fever, the inflammation of the eyes, the back pain. He was the first to document the intense breathing symptoms that are a hallmark of the disease, the hoarseness of the voice and blockage of the nostrils and the dry cough. He understood that this was not just a skin disease. It was a whole-body illness, one that began deep within the body and worked its way out. Then he describes the rash itself. He carefully contrasts the eruption of measles with that of smallpox. Smallpox pustules, he explains, are deep, individual, and appear over several days, eventually forming the hard, scarring lesions that made the disease so frightening. The measles rash, he observes, is different. It appears like small pimples very close together, merging all at once and giving the skin a flushed reddish appearance, as if it were a violent erysipelas, almost universal. He noted its progression, typically appearing first on the face and behind the ears before spreading downwards to cover the entire body. He even documented the characteristic fine bran-like peeling of the skin as the patient recovered. Beyond the physical signs, Rhazes provided a theoretical framework for the disease grounded in the humoral theory of his time, but driven by his own observations. He believed the illness was a process of fermentation of the blood, a natural, if dangerous, process of maturation that was most common in childhood. He saw the eruption of the rash not as the disease itself, but as the body's attempt to expel the extra, harmful matters from the blood to the surface. While the mechanism was wrong, the clinical instinct was brilliant. It recognized measles as a predictable step-by-step process, a journey with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in doing so, he gave physicians a roadmap. His treatise outlined treatment strategies, careful management of fever, rest, hydration with barley water, and soothing remedies to ease the cough and sore eyes. He advised on the best time to let blood if necessary, and how to tell a simple case from one complicated by pneumonia, which he accurately identified as the most dangerous outcome. The importance of this work cannot be overstated. By giving measles a name and a clear clinical definition, Rhazes transformed it from a mysterious terror into a known quantity. His book was translated into Latin and other languages, becoming a standard medical text in Europe for the next 1,000 years. For centuries, physicians from Isfahan to Paris to London would see the telltale rash on a child's face and see it through the eyes of Rhazes. He had provided the essential first step in confronting any enemy, a clear and accurate identification. He established the clinical foundation upon which all later understanding of measles would be built. He had separated the shadow from its twin, and in that act of intellectual courage, he dragged measles out of the realm of folklore and into the clear, unforgiving light of medical science. The disease was now known. Its ancient patterns of spread, however, were about to be violently disrupted, as humanity itself entered an age of unprecedented global connection, an age that would take this childhood disease of the old world and turn it into an apocalyptic force in the new. For thousands of years, the measles virus had been a creature of Eurasia and Africa. It traveled at the speed of a walking person, a loaded camel, or a ship hugging the coastline. It moved along the Silk Road, a hidden passenger in the caravans carrying silk and spices. It rode the waves of Roman legions and the Mongol hordes. Its spread was slow, gradual, seeping into new populations over centuries, allowing for a slow, painful coexistence to develop. But the world was about to shrink. The late 15th century saw the dawn of a new era of exploration driven by European powers with their deep-hulled ships, their navigation tools, and their endless appetite for trade, conquest and conversion. These voyages stitched the continents together into a single global network. They created pathways, not just for goods and ideas, but for microbes. This was the beginning of the Columbian Exchange, the vast unintentional transfer of plants, animals, cultures, and most devastatingly diseases between the old world and the new. The peoples of the Americas, the Pacific Islands, and Australia had been living in effective biological isolation for at least 15,000 years. Their civilizations had risen and fallen. Their empires had clashed, but they had done so without exposure to the rich and deadly collection of pathogens that had evolved in the crowded animal-filled petri dish of Eurasia. They had no smallpox, no influenza, no typhus, and no measles. Their immune systems were, in the stark language of epidemiology, virgin soil. They were immunologically naive. When the first European ships dropped anchor off their shores, they unknowingly unleashed biological weapons far more potent than any cannon or musket. The first blow was typically smallpox. The Great Pandemic of 1520, for example, has been credited with shattering the Aztec Empire, killing a huge portion of the population of Tenochtitlan, including the emperor, and paving the way for the Spanish conquest. But smallpox was only the first wave. Measles was often part of the second or third wave of death, and in some ways it was even more sneaky. Smallpox was a terrifying killer of all ages, but measles in these virgin populations behaved differently than it did in Europe. It was not a childhood disease because there was no reservoir of immune adults. Everyone was a child in the eyes of the virus. It swept through communities and struck down everyone simultaneously. The farmer in the field, the mother caring for her children, the hunter, the priest, the chief. Imagine a village in the highlands of 16th century Peru. A rumor arrives of a new sickness from the coast, a fever with a red rash. A trader feeling unwell but needing to complete his journey brings it with him. Within a week, the first cases appear. Within 2 weeks, the entire village is flat on their backs. The fever is high. The cough is relentless. The light is torture to their inflamed eyes. But the true disaster is practical. There is no one to fetch water. There is no one to tend the fires. There is no one to prepare food. The crops rot in the fields. The infants whose mothers are too sick to nurse them die first. Then the elderly. Then the adults. Not always from the virus itself, but from dehydration, from starvation, from secondary bacterial pneumonia that rage unchecked through their weakened bodies. A healthy community can absorb the sickness of its children, but a community where every single person is struck down at once simply stops working. It collapses. This scenario was repeated thousands of times across the Americas. Following the Spanish conquest, a series of catastrophic epidemics in which measles played a leading role swept through the indigenous population. The population collapse was almost beyond understanding. Conservative estimates suggest that the population of the Americas fell by as much as 90% in the century following Columbus's arrival. This was not merely a tragedy. It was a strategic factor in the European colonial project. The great empires of the Aztecs and the Incas, already reeling from smallpox, were further hollowed out by following waves of measles and other diseases. It created a power vacuum. It broke lines of political succession, shattered social structures, and caused a deep spiritual crisis. The gods seemed to have abandoned them, while the invaders, who often had immunity from childhood exposure and walked unharmed through the dying villages, appeared to be protected by their own more powerful deity. Disease didn't just help conquest. It was, in many ways, the main tool of conquest. The pattern was not limited to the Americas. As European exploration pushed into the vast Pacific, the same tragic story unfolded on a smaller, more intimate scale. Islands that had been isolated for 1,000 years were suddenly connected to the global microbial network. Let us travel to Fiji in the year 1875. The islands had recently been given to the British Empire. The Fijian chief, Ratu Seru Epenisa Kakobau, along with his 2 sons, was invited to visit Sydney, Australia, as a guest of the colonial governor. It was a diplomatic trip, a symbol of a new era. While in Sydney, which was then experiencing a measles outbreak, the chief and his sons caught the virus. They were ill, but they recovered. They were unaware that they were now carrying a deadly passenger. They returned to Fiji aboard the HMS Dido. Upon their arrival, great celebratory gatherings were held. Chiefs and representatives from all across the archipelago came to welcome their leader home, to feast and to talk. It was the perfect transmission event. In the close quarters of the gatherings, the virus shed in the breathing droplets of the still recovering royal party spread with silent, invisible efficiency. The visiting chiefs then carried it home with them to every corner of the islands. The result was an apocalypse. Within 4 months, the 1875 Fiji measles epidemic killed more than 40,000 people, a full third of the entire Fijian population. Entire villages were wiped out. So many died so quickly that there was no one left to perform the traditional burial rites. The living were too sick to care for the dying. The carefully tended taro fields were abandoned and overgrown with weeds. A terrible silence fell over the islands, broken only by the sound of mourning. An eyewitness, the Reverend Frederick Langham, wrote of the sick, the dying, and the dead, all in the same hut. It was a population, social and cultural disaster, from which Fiji would take generations to recover. These virgin soil epidemics reveal the true nature of measles. In its endemic state in the crowded cities of the Old World, it was a predator that had learned to farm its prey, taking a reliable portion from each new generation of children. But when unleashed on a completely vulnerable population, its ferocity was absolute. It demonstrated how deeply connected the story of humanity is with the story of our diseases. The lines on the map, the rise and fall of empires, the balance of global power, all were shaped not just by armies and economics, but by the microscopic workings of a virus that had made the leap from cattle thousands of years ago, a virus that traveled the world in the breath of explorers and conquerors and remade it in its own image. Before the needle, before the cool swab of alcohol on a small arm, before the simple, quiet miracle of a vaccine, measles was not a choice. It was not a debate. It was a certainty, a shadow that fell across every cradle, a debt that childhood was expected to pay. In the sprawling industrialized cities of the 20th century, from the brownstones of Brooklyn to the terraces of Manchester, the virus was an architect of the family calendar. It was a seasonal ruler arriving with the closing of windows in the autumn and holding power until the fresh air of spring. For a mother in 1950, the question was not if her child would get measles, but when. The germ was so contagious, so woven into the very fabric of human gathering, that by the age of 15, more than 90% of the population had been infected. It was a universal experience, a shared fever dream. This widespread presence bred a strange and dangerous familiarity, a kind of weary acceptance. Measles became a rite of passage, a phrase that sounds almost charming until you look at it more closely. It was a rite that involved a week or two of misery, a hacking cough that seemed to tear at the lungs, eyes so inflamed and sensitive to light that they had to be shielded in darkened rooms, and a fever that could climb to a staggering 104, 105 degrees, turning a child's mind into a landscape of confused phantoms. And then came the sign, the rash. It began, as it always did, as fine, faint spots behind the ears and on the forehead, before marching steadily downwards, a relentless red tide that consumed the face, the torso, the limbs, until the child was a single blotchy proof of the virus's total occupation. Inside the mouth, on the soft tissue of the cheeks, tiny white specks would appear like grains of salt on a red background. These were Koplik spots, the unique calling card of the measles virus, a diagnostic certainty for any physician who knew to look. For most, this grim passage ended with a slow recovery. The fever would break, the rash would fade, and the child would be left with something invaluable, lifelong immunity. This predictable outcome led to a bizarre form of folk medicine, a desperate piece of public health calculation performed in living rooms and on front porches, the measles party. The logic was grimly practical. Since the disease was inevitable, and since it was generally thought to be milder in younger children, parents would intentionally expose their healthy children to an infected child. It was a roll of the dice, a deliberate invitation to the wolf in the hope that it would be a less hungry one. Get it over with. Control the uncontrollable. It was a strategy born of utter helplessness, a flimsy shield against a biological certainty. But the familiarity was a mask for a predator of deep capabilities. Measles was not a simple childhood illness. It was a whole-body invasion, and its true danger lay not in the rash or the fever, but in its complications, the brutal aftershocks that followed the initial quake. The virus was a master of suppression. As it multiplied, it waged a silent, devastating war on the immune system, specifically targeting the very cells meant to protect the body. It caused a state of temporary but deep forgetting in the immune system's memory cells, erasing the hard-won knowledge of past infections. A child who survived measles was for a time immunologically naive again, vulnerable to every other germ in the environment. This vulnerability opened the door to a host of secondary invaders. The most common was pneumonia. The harsh, dry cough of the initial infection would transform into a wet, rattling struggle for breath as bacteria seized the opportunity to colonize the damaged lung tissue. In the pre-antibiotic era, this was often a death sentence. Even in the 50s, with penicillin available, it was a severe and life-threatening condition that filled the children's wards of every major hospital. In the United States alone, in any given year before the vaccine, measles would cause tens of thousands of hospitalizations. Then there were the ears. Otitis media, a middle ear infection, was a constant companion to measles, occurring in as many as 1 in 10 cases. The bacteria would march up the eustachian tube into the inflamed space behind the eardrum. The result was terrible pain, and if left unchecked or if treatment failed, permanent hearing loss. Thousands of children every year were left partially or completely deaf by a disease that society had dismissed as a simple rite of passage. The virus could also attack the eyes directly. The conjunctivitis was miserable, but a secondary bacterial infection could lead to keratitis, an ulceration of the cornea. In places with poor nutrition, particularly a lack of vitamin A, This could progress rapidly to scarring and permanent blindness. Across the globe, measles was a leading cause of childhood blindness, stealing the light from hundreds of thousands of children. But the most feared complication, the one that haunted the nightmares of parents and pediatricians alike, was encephalitis. In approximately 1 out of every 1,000 cases, the virus would cross the blood-brain barrier and launch a direct assault on the central nervous system. This was post-infectious encephalomyelitis, a catastrophic inflammatory response. A child who seemed to be recovering, whose rash was fading, would suddenly develop a new spiking fever. They would become drowsy, then irritable, then convulse. A coma could follow. The brain would swell against the unyielding bone of the skull. Of those who developed measles encephalitis, 15% would die. Of the survivors, another 25 to 40% would be left with permanent brain damage. They would be sentenced to a life of seizures, intellectual disability, deafness, or paralysis. In the United States, in the decade before the vaccine, the measles virus was killing roughly 400 to 500 people every year, mostly children. It was causing permanent brain damage in 1,000 more every single year. This was the true cost of the rite of passage. It was the price hidden in the averages, the silent toll of a routine disease. The Welsh author Roald Dahl, who would later delight millions of children with his stories, knew this toll intimately. In 1962, his 7-year-old daughter, Olivia, got measles. She developed encephalitis. She died. The routine had turned lethal, as it did for hundreds of families year after year after year. There was one more shadow, a rarer, but perhaps even more terrifying ghost in the machine, a degenerative fatal brain disorder called subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, or SSPE. This was not a direct complication, but a long-tail consequence. Years, even a decade after a child had seemingly recovered from measles, a defective version of the virus, hiding dormant in their brain cells, would reawaken. It would begin a slow, unstoppable destruction of the brain. The child would experience subtle personality changes, then intellectual decline, seizures, and a gradual loss of all motor control. It was always fatal. It was a time bomb planted in childhood with a fuse of unknown length. This was the baseline, the accepted reality of a world without a defense, an airborne germ that found nearly everyone, and for a significant fraction, left behind a legacy of death, deafness, blindness, and brain ruin. And if this was its impact during times of relative stability and modern medicine, its behavior during times of social fracture, when humanity gathered itself for war, was another matter entirely. It became not just a plague of children, but a strategic weapon of devastating power. The American Civil War was a conflict of many firsts. The first widespread use of railroads to move troops, the first clash of ironclad warships, the first time the nation tore itself apart over its own founding contradictions. But it was also a massive, unplanned and catastrophic biological experiment, and one of the most effective killers in this war carried no rifle and wore no uniform. It was the measles virus. When the call to arms came in 1861, hundreds of thousands of young men answered. They came from the growing cities of the North, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and from the farming towns of the South. But crucially, a vast number of them came from isolated rural communities. They were farm boys from the hollows of Appalachia, the prairies of Illinois, the backwoods of Mississippi. In their small, scattered settlements, they had lived their entire lives in what epidemiologists call a virgin soil population. They had never encountered measles. The virus simply couldn't sustain itself in communities too small and too far apart. They had no immunity. They were, in a biological sense, as vulnerable as infants. These men were then brought together by the logistics of war, packed into vast, sprawling training camps. Camp Douglas in Chicago, Camp Chase in Ohio, camps around Richmond and Washington, D.C. They were crowded into tents designed for a handful of men, but often housing a dozen. They shared blankets, drinking cups, and the very air they breathed. Sanitation was an afterthought. The conditions were, in short, a perfect incubator for an airborne respiratory virus. When measles was introduced into this environment, and it was always introduced, carried in by a single recruit from a city, it did not just spread, it exploded. The results were immediate and devastating. Entire regiments were leveled before they ever heard a shot fired in anger. The official reports from army surgeons read like a list of despair. In the winter of 1861, the Army of the Potomac gathering in its camps around Washington was ravaged. In one 3-month period, nearly 1,000 cases were reported. A Confederate surgeon in North Carolina wrote that measles more constantly and extensively prevails than any other. He noted that one regiment, the 28th North Carolina, had 500 of its 800 men sick with the disease at the same time. This wasn't just a medical problem, it was a strategic crisis. A general could not plan an offensive when a third of his fighting force was unable to function, burning with fever and too weak to stand, let alone march with a 60-pound pack. The virus became a force multiplier for the enemy. It thinned the ranks, crippled logistics, and shattered morale. The numbers are staggering and speak to a reality of 19th century warfare that is often overlooked in the face of cannon and cavalry charges. For every soldier killed on the battlefield, 2 died of disease, and measles was one of the prime culprits, not always as the direct cause of death, but as the great enabler. Just as it did in children, the virus suppressed the immune system of these young soldiers, leaving them defenseless against the armies of other germs that thrived in the camps. The common cold became a killer. A bout of diarrhea could become fatal dysentery. The true killer, however, was pneumonia. The hacking measles cough echoing through the drafty tents on a cold winter night was often the prelude to the soldier's final struggle as his lungs filled with fluid. The records of a single Union division in the winter of 1861 show over 2,000 cases of measles. Of these, 300 men developed pneumonia, and of those, 101 died. That is more men killed by the consequences of a single virus in one division than were lost in many of the war's smaller yet more famous battles. Consider the 2nd Vermont Infantry. They arrived in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1861, 1,000 strong, healthy farm boys ready for a fight. Within months, measles swept through their camp. Over the course of the war, the regiment would fight in nearly every major battle in the Eastern Theater, from Bull Run to Appomattox. They earned a reputation for courage and tenacity. Yet, their official records tell a second, quieter story. By the end of the war, 153 men from the 2nd Vermont had been killed in action or died of their wounds. Another 145 had died of disease. Measles and its following complications were a primary driver of that grim statistic. The story was the same across the board, North and South. The 12th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry was so crippled by a measles outbreak in Louisiana in 1862 that it was deemed unfit for duty for weeks. Confederate General John B. Gordon recalled how his brigade was flattened by measles, mumps, and fever, leaving him with more sick than well men. The military medical corps, overwhelmed and operating with the limited knowledge of the time, could do little. They established quarantine tents, the 19th century version of an isolation ward. But it was often too little, too late for a virus that is contagious for 4 days before the rash even appears. Quarantine was a useless gesture in a crowded camp. They treated the symptoms as best they could, prescribing bed rest, attempting to keep the men warm and hydrated, and offering useless mixtures of whiskey and quinine. But they were helpless against the virus itself and had no effective weapons against the bacterial pneumonia that followed in its wake. All they could do was watch and count and sign the death certificates. Cause of death, rubeola, or more often, febris or pneumonia, the secondary infection hiding the primary culprit. The measles virus was a ghost in the military machine, a silent saboteur that inflicted more casualties than Stonewall Jackson's flanking maneuvers or Grant's relentless advances. It was an enemy that could not be seen, could not be fought, and which demonstrated with brutal clarity that the gathering of armies was as much a biological event as it was a political one. It taught a lesson that would be repeated in every major conflict until the 20th century, that the deadliest foe on the battlefield is often microscopic. For centuries, this enemy remained a phantom. Humanity could see its effects, the rash, the fever, the trail of destruction. But the agent itself was invisible, a ghost that moved through families, towns, and armies without a name or a face. Chasing down this ghost, capturing it, and forcing it to reveal its secrets would require a new kind of warfare waged not in trenches, but in the sterile quiet of the laboratory. It would be a battle of patience, of careful process, and of deep insight, fought by a small army of scientists armed with microscopes, glass pipettes, and the unshakable belief that what could be understood could eventually be conquered. The early work was tentative and halting. In the 1750s, a Scottish physician named Francis Home, working from the observation that measles seemed to give lifelong immunity, attempted to inoculate people against it. In a manner similar to the early efforts against smallpox, he collected blood from an infected patient and introduced it via a small cut into a healthy individual. He had some limited and very dangerous success, sometimes causing a milder form of the disease, but the method was unreliable and risky. He was, after all, transmitting the whole untamed virus. His work was a brave shot in the dark, but he lacked the tools to understand what he was truly fighting. A century later, in 1846, a young Danish doctor named Peter Panum was sent to the Faroe Islands, a remote group of islands in the North Atlantic, to investigate a devastating measles epidemic. Because of their isolation, the islands had not seen measles since 1781. An entire generation had grown up with no immunity. When the virus was reintroduced by a traveling cabinet maker, it tore through the population of nearly 8,000 people. Over 6,000 fell ill. Panum, in a brilliant feat of disease detective work, went from village to village, interviewing survivors, charting the spread of the disease. He carefully documented who got sick and who did not. He observed that none of the elderly islanders who'd been infected in the 1781 epidemic became ill again, providing the first hard scientific evidence for lifelong immunity. More importantly, by tracking the exact timing of the virus's movement from one isolated village to the next, he was able to calculate with remarkable precision its incubation period, 14 days from exposure to the appearance of the rash. He had put a clock on the ghost. He had defined its behavior. But he still could not see it. The final hunt would have to wait another century for the arrival of the tools of modern virology. The breakthrough that made it all possible came not from measles research, but from the war against another great childhood crippler, polio. In 1949, a team at Boston Children's Hospital, led by the brilliant and unassuming virologist John Enders, along with his younger colleagues Thomas Weller and Frederick Robbins, achieved something revolutionary. For decades, scientists believed that the polio virus could only be grown in nervous system tissue, a difficult and impractical medium for research. Enders, Weller, and Robbins proved this belief wrong. They showed that the virus could be grown and sustained in cultures of non-nervous tissue like human embryonic skin and muscle cells kept alive in glass tubes filled with a nutrient broth. They could watch under the microscope as the virus infected the cells and destroyed them, a phenomenon they called a cytopathic effect. It was a staggering achievement that opened the floodgates of virology and would win them the Nobel Prize in '54. They had in effect built a stable, a pen where for the first time these invisible viral beasts could be kept, studied and grown. The stage was now set for the capture of the measles virus, and the man who would take the lead was a young, ambitious physician working in Enders' lab named Thomas Peebles. In the winter of 1953 to 1954, a fierce measles outbreak was sweeping through the Boston area. Enders saw an opportunity. He sent Peebles, his boots on the ground, to collect samples from sick children, hoping they could use their new tissue culture techniques to finally trap the measles agent. Peebles visited several locations, but his most important stop was at the Fay School, a private boarding school in nearby Southborough, Massachusetts. There, among the rows of sick boys, he found an 11-year-old named David Edmonston. The boy was in the early stages of the disease, feverish and just beginning to show the telltale signs. Peebles took a throat swab and, crucially, a blood sample. Back in the lab on Longwood Avenue, the painstaking work began. Peebles and the team took the blood from David Edmonston, separated the serum, and introduced it to their carefully prepared cultures of human kidney cells. The process was methodical, almost mundane. The glass tubes containing the cells and the sample were placed in incubators, kept at a precise body temperature. The nutrient media had to be changed regularly. Everything had to be kept sterile to prevent contamination from stray bacteria or fungi. And then they waited and they watched. For days, nothing happened. The kidney cells in the culture remained healthy, a flat, unremarkable layer on the surface of the glass. It was frustrating, exacting work, peering through the microscope day after day, looking for a sign that wasn't there. But then on the 9th day, Peebles saw it. A change. In one of the tubes, the cells were no longer lying flat. They were beginning to clump together, fusing their membranes to form large, misshapen masses with multiple nuclei. These giant syncytial cells were grotesque, dying things. It was a cytopathic effect, but one entirely different from what they had seen with polio. It was the virus's unique signature, its footprint in the cellular landscape. They had seen the ghost. To be certain, they had to prove it. They took fluid from this first successful culture and used it to infect a fresh tube of healthy cells. The same bizarre clumping destruction occurred. They repeated this process again and again, passing the invisible agent from culture to culture, proving that it was self-replicating. This was no chemical toxin. This was a living, or at least lifelike entity. The final proof came when they took this cultured agent and mixed it with serum from a patient who had recovered from measles. Serum they knew was full of antibodies. When this mixture was added to a fresh cell culture, nothing happened. The cells remained healthy. The antibodies had neutralized the agent. This was the smoking gun. They had captured the measles virus. The sample, taken from David Edmonston, would become immortalized in the records of medicine as the Edmonston strain, the ancestor of nearly all measles vaccines that would follow. The year was 1954. John Enders and Thomas Peebles published their findings in a landmark paper. After thousands of years of plagues, after generations of being a dreaded rite of childhood, after crippling armies and stealing children, the virus was finally cornered. It was no longer a ghost. It was a real entity in a test tube, a string of genetic code that could be grown, studied, manipulated, and most importantly, weakened. The capture was complete. The scientific war against measles could now begin in earnest. The path to cornering a ghost begins not with a chase, but with a trap. For centuries, measles had been an invisible, untouchable force of nature, a seasonal wind that swept through nurseries and schoolyards. To fight it, one first had to catch it, not just in the lungs of a feverish child, but in a place where it could be held, studied, and ultimately disarmed. The trap was not made of steel or wood, but of glass and a nutrient-rich pinkish broth. And the trap makers were not hunting measles at all. They were hunting a different monster, a more terrifying one in the public imagination of post-war America. Poliomyelitis. In a laboratory at Boston Children's Hospital, a quiet, methodical man named John Enders, along with his two younger brilliant colleagues, Thomas Weller and Frederick Robbins, were carefully rewriting the rules of virology. The common belief was that poliovirus, the agent of infantile paralysis, would only grow in nerve tissue. This made it maddeningly difficult to study. Growing it in the nerve cells of monkeys was expensive, morally troubling, and yielded frustratingly small amounts of the virus. It was a scientific bottleneck, holding back any real progress toward a vaccine. Enders, however, was a man who favored patient observation over received wisdom. He had a kind of calm, systematic skepticism. He and his team decided to try something that everyone else thought was a waste of time. They took samples of the polio virus and introduced them not to precious nerve tissue, but to something far more common. Human embryonic skin and muscle cells kept alive in a simple glass tube. They placed these tubes in a slowly rotating drum, washing the cells in a gentle bath of nutrients and antibiotics, a mixture that could keep the tissue alive for weeks, and then they waited. The work was slow, painstaking, almost agricultural. It was the opposite of a dramatic breakthrough. It was the careful tending of a garden in a bottle. The sign of success was not a sudden explosion of discovery, but a subtle change in color. The nutrient broth contained a pH indicator, phenol red, which gave it a cheerful pink color when healthy. But as the virus began to multiply, it killed the cells. And as the cells died, they released acid, causing the broth to slowly turn from pink to a somber, telltale yellow. They called it the cytopathic effect. For the first time, they could see the virus's work without a microscope, without sacrificing a monkey. They had found a window into the invisible world. They had found a way to grow polio in a jar. For this seemingly simple innovation, this elegant bypassing of a decades-old problem, Enders, Weller, and Robbins would be awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine in '54. Their discovery unlocked the door for Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin, paving the way for the vaccines that would conquer polio. But the key they had forged fit more than one lock. That very same year, 1954, as the Nobel Committee was recognizing their monumental achievement, a vicious measles outbreak tore through the Fay School, a private boarding school for boys in Southborough, Massachusetts. A young physician named Thomas Peebles, then a researcher in Ender's lab, saw an opportunity. Armed with the team's new technique, he drove out to the school, a man on a mission. He moved through the infirmary, past the rows of coughing, feverish boys with their flushed, blotchy faces. He was looking for the perfect sample. He found it in a 13-year-old boy named David Edmonston. Peebles took a swab from the back of David's throat and carefully placed it in a sterile container. Back in the Boston lab, he performed a procedure that was now, thanks to the polio work, almost routine. He prepared a culture of human kidney cells in a bath of that same pink nutrient broth. He introduced the throat washings from young David Edmonston, and again he waited. Within a few days, something began to happen in the culture dish. But it wasn't the simple cell death they saw with polio. There was something stranger, something uniquely measles. Peebles peered through the microscope and saw the cells behaving bizarrely. Instead of dying off individually, they began to fuse together. Their membranes dissolved and they merged into vast multinucleated monstrosities called syncytia. They looked like great sprawling amoebas, giant cells with dozens of nuclei swimming within a single shared cytoplasm. It was the virus's calling card, its unmistakable microscopic signature. This was it. They had it. The ghost that had haunted humanity for thousands of years was finally caught, pinned to a glass slide growing obediently in a laboratory in Boston. The specific strain of the virus, the one that would become the ancestor of nearly every measles vaccine to follow, was given a name in honor of the boy who'd provided it. It was called the Edmonston strain. The trap had been sprung. Now the far more difficult work of taming the beast could begin. With the Edmonston strain of measles virus now living in their laboratory freezers, a new kind of race began. It was no longer a hunt, but a delicate, dangerous process of domestication. The wild virus taken directly from David Edmonston was a powerful killer. Injecting it into a person would simply give them a raging case of measles. The challenge was to create what scientists call an attenuated virus, a virus that was weakened, humbled, taught to be gentle. The goal was to create a version that was still alive enough to trigger the immune system into creating lifelong antibodies, but too feeble to cause serious illness. It had to be a shadow of its former self, a sparring partner for the body's defenses, not a lethal opponent. The primary method for achieving this was as elegant as it was tedious, a process of serial passage. It was a form of directed accelerated evolution in a bottle. John Enders and his team in Boston took the lead. They began by taking the virus and growing it in a culture of human kidney cells. Once the virus had multiplied, they would take a tiny sample from that culture and use it to infect a fresh batch of cells. They did this again and again and again, 24 times in human kidney cells. Then they shifted the environment, moving the virus to a culture of human amnion cells, the tissue from the sac that surrounds a fetus. Here it was passed another 24 times. With each transfer or passage, the virus was forced to adapt to its new artificial home. Tiny errors in its genetic code, mutations would arise. Most were useless, but occasionally a mutation would make the virus slightly better at multiplying in the lab-grown cells. These fitter viruses would outcompete their siblings. Over dozens of generations, the virus was slowly changing, becoming a creature of the laboratory, perfectly suited to a life in a glass flask. The final and most crucial step was to move it into a completely non-human environment. They took the now well-traveled virus and began passing it through cells derived from chick embryos. The logic was simple. A virus that becomes an expert at infecting chicken cells will in the process forget how to be an effective human germ. It would lose the keys to the locks on human cells. It was a long, slow process of re-education. It took years. After 28 passages in chick embryo cells, Ender's team believed they had done it. They had created a weakened strain which they called Edmonston B. In 1961, they began testing it in children. It worked. The vaccine produced a powerful immune response, and it protected against measles. But the beast was not yet fully tamed. The Edmonston B vaccine was still, as they said, a bit hot. A significant number of children who received it, perhaps as many as half, developed a high fever. About a third developed a faint measles-like rash. It was far, far safer than wild measles. But the side effects were concerning enough that doctors were advised to give the vaccine along with a second injection, a dose of gamma globulin, a blood product containing antibodies pulled from recovered measles patients. This second shot acted as a brake, dampening the vaccine's reaction. It was an effective, if clumsy, two-pronged solution. In 1963, this combination became the first licensed measles vaccine in the United States, a huge victory, but an imperfect one. While Enders was carefully working in his academic lab, others were pursuing a different path. Some companies like Pfizer developed a killed or inactivated vaccine. The approach seemed safer on the surface. They would grow vast quantities of the measles virus and then kill it with a chemical, usually formaldehyde. The dead virus particles could then be injected, and since they weren't alive, there was zero risk of them multiplying and causing fever or a rash. The initial trials looked promising, and a killed vaccine was also licensed in 1963, but it harbored a hidden fatal flaw. The immunity it produced was tragically weak and short-lived. Worse, it created a bizarre and dangerous sensitization in the body. When a child who had received the killed vaccine was later exposed to the real wild measles virus, their immune system would overreact in a catastrophic way. They developed a condition called atypical measles syndrome with soaring fevers, unusual rashes, and severe pneumonia. It was a disastrous dead end, a cautionary tale about the subtle complexities of the immune system. The safer-looking path had turned out to be far more treacherous. The final refinement, the masterstroke that would produce the global standard for the measles vaccine, came from a man who was arguably the greatest vaccine maker of the 20th century, Maurice Hilleman. Hilleman was a gruff, pragmatic, intensely driven scientist working at the pharmaceutical giant Merck. He was not a tinkerer, he was a finisher. He looked at Ender's Edmundston B strain and saw both its genius and its imperfection. He believed it could be made better, safer, more elegant. He acquired the strain from Ender's group and simply kept going. Hilleman and his team at Merck took the Edmundston B virus and continued the process of attenuation. They subjected it to more passages in chick embryo cell cultures, more than 40 in total. Crucially, they also grew the virus at a slightly lower temperature, a subtle stress that pushed its evolution in a new direction. This additional forced domestication worked wonders. It sanded off the remaining rough edges of the virus. The result was a new strain which Hilleman, in a nod to its origins, initially called the Edmundston-Enders strain. It would eventually be known as the Moreton strain, standing for more attenuated. It was the perfect balance. It was alive enough to produce a robust lifelong immunity in over 95% of recipients from a single shot. But it was so weakened, so thoroughly domesticated, that the side effects of fever and rash were dramatically reduced. It was safe enough to be given on its own without the need for a concurrent shot of gamma globulin. This was the elegant one-shot solution the world had been waiting for. Hilleman's further attenuated vaccine was licensed in 1968. He had taken a breakthrough and perfected it. The tools were now complete. After thousands of years of suffering, humanity finally had a shield forged in the quiet, patient laboratories of Boston and West Point, Pennsylvania. The question was no longer whether the plague could be stopped, but whether society had the will to do it. By the mid-1960s, the weapons were on the table. The United States had 2 effective licensed live virus vaccines, Ender's original Edmundston B strain, typically given with a dose of gamma globulin, and a handful of other similar vaccines from competing manufacturers. Yet measles remained a stubborn fact of American life. The vaccines were available, but they weren't being used universally. Uptake was patchy, voluntary, disorganized. Each year, hundreds of thousands of cases were still being reported. Thousands of children were still being left with brain damage or deafness. Hundreds were still dying. The disease had been rendered preventable, but it had not yet been prevented. It was in this environment in 1966 that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, made a public announcement of almost breathtaking boldness. Led by its director, Dr. David Sencher, the agency announced a new national goal. It was not control. It was not reduction. It was eradication. The complete elimination of local measles transmission from the entire United States. And they aimed to do it in a single year by the end of 1967. To the general public and even to many in the medical community, the goal seemed fantastical, a brand of uniquely American can-do confidence. Eradication of any disease is a huge undertaking. At the time, smallpox was the only candidate for global eradication, and that was still a work in progress. To declare war on a disease as contagious as measles, a germ so common that it was widely considered a routine, unavoidable rite of passage, seemed almost absurd. It was like declaring war on the common cold or on skinned knees. But Sensor and his team at the CDC were deadly serious. They had a strategy, a multi-pronged assault that combined epidemiology, mass logistics, and public persuasion on a scale never before seen for a childhood disease. This was not to be a gentle suggestion, but a full-blown public health war. The first element of the campaign was intelligence. To defeat an enemy, you must first know where it is. The CDC put in place a comprehensive national watching system. Every single case of measles from every doctor's office and every hospital in every county was to be reported immediately to public health authorities. This data flowed into the CDC in Atlanta, creating for the first time a real-time map of the disease. They could see outbreaks forming as they happened, track the virus as it moved from town to town, from school to school. It was a shift from passive acceptance to active pursuit. The ghost would no longer be allowed to move unseen. The second and most critical element was the offensive itself, a massive federally funded vaccination drive. The goal was to rapidly raise the level of immunity in the childhood population to above the critical threshold required for herd immunity, the point at which the virus simply runs out of new vulnerable bodies to infect and sputters out. This was not left to chance or to the whims of individual parents. The federal government poured millions of dollars into buying vaccine and supporting state and local health departments to administer it. This was public health as a grand logistical exercise. It meant vaccine stockpiles, refrigerated supply chains, and outreach programs. It meant clinics held not just in doctors' offices, but in school gymnasiums, in church basements, in community centers. The sound of the era was not the cough of a sick child, but the mechanical thump hiss of the jet injector. This device, a pneumatic gun that used high pressure to force the vaccine through the skin without a needle, was a marvel of efficiency. A small team of nurses armed with jet injectors could move down a line of nervous children, vaccinating hundreds in an hour. It was the instrument of mass immunity, a piece of machinery designed to build a wall of antibodies around an entire generation. But the guns and the data were useless without public buy-in. The third front of the war was persuasion. The CDC and its partners launched a sweeping public information campaign to fundamentally change the way Americans thought about measles. For generations, the cultural narrative had been one of resignation. Everyone gets it. It's better to get it over with when you're young. The new campaign aggressively dismantled that narrative. It reframed measles not as a trivial nuisance, but as a serious, potentially devastating disease. Posters appeared in schools and post offices showing healthy, smiling children with the caption, "They've been vaccinated against measles." Pamphlets detailed the grim statistics of complications. 1 in 1,000 cases results in encephalitis, the swelling of the brain that could lead to convulsions, deafness, or intellectual disability. 1 or 2 out of every 1,000 would die. The messaging was clear, direct, and unapologetic. The campaign used fear, but it was a rational fear grounded in data designed to counteract a culture of complacency. It sought to make the vaccine not just an option, but an urgent necessity, the clear and obvious choice for any responsible parent. Finally, the campaign was given legal teeth. As the federal push gained momentum, states began to enact and enforce a simple, powerful rule. No shots, no school. Laws were passed requiring children to show proof of measles vaccination before they could be enrolled in elementary school. This was the masterstroke, the mechanism that would ensure the campaign reached not just a majority of children, but almost all of them. It transformed vaccination from a personal medical decision into a requirement for public education, a civic duty. The school mandates closed the gaps, catching the children of the forgetful, the procrastinating, and the skeptical. The 1-year goal of eradication by the end of 1967 proved to be, as many had suspected, too ambitious. The virus was too cunning, the country too large. But the impact of the campaign was nothing short of staggering. In 1966, before the eradication effort began, there were nearly 500,000 reported cases of measles. By 68, just 2 years later, that number had plummeted to around 22,000, a drop of more than 95%. The charts at the CDC told the story in a single dramatic, plunging line. That line was not an abstract statistic. It represented hundreds of thousands of children who did not get sick. It was thousands of hospital beds that remained empty. It was hundreds of lives that were not lost. The war continued through the 70s. a long, grinding campaign of mopping up. With the arrival of Hillerman's improved, more attenuated vaccine in 1968, the final tool was in place. Outbreak response teams would now descend on any reported cluster of cases, isolating the sick and vaccinating all contacts to build a ring of immunity around the flare-up, starving it of fuel. By the end of the next decade, measles was no longer a rite of passage. It was a rarity. The bold goal, while not met on its impossible timeline, had succeeded in its ultimate aim. The childhood plague that had defined generations had been brought to its knees by an unprecedented mobilization of science, logistics, and political will. The quiet in the pediatric infectious disease wards was the new, unfamiliar, and deeply welcomed sound of victory. The great engine of public health is often powered not by singular dramatic breakthroughs, but by quiet revolutions in logistics. The creation of a measles vaccine was the dramatic breakthrough, a flash of scientific lightning. But what followed was the slow, steady, and arguably more difficult work of making that miracle a mundane routine part of childhood. By the late 1960s, a child in the developed world could be protected from measles, but also from polio, from diphtheria, from tetanus, from whooping cough. Their young immune systems were being educated, but their calendars and their parents' patience were becoming crowded with appointments. Each disease required its own shot, sometimes multiple doses. It was a triumph of medicine that was becoming a challenge of human behavior. And into this challenge walked a man who seemed to embody the very concept of blunt, practical efficiency. His name was Maurice Hillerman. Hillerman was not a man given to grand pronouncements or poetic reflections on his work. He was a farmer's son from the harsh plains of Montana, and he carried that practicality with him into the laboratory at Merck. He was famously, almost comically profane. He was gruff. He was demanding. He was by all accounts the single most important and prolific vaccine developer of the 20th century, a man credited with developing more than 40 vaccines, and by conservative estimates, saving more lives than any other single scientist in history. He saw the cluttered vaccination schedule not as a medical problem, but as a simple, infuriating inefficiency. Why bring a child in for 3 separate appointments, 3 separate needle sticks, when you could theoretically do it all at once? The idea of a combination vaccine was the holy grail, a single shot to protect against multiple threats. But it was an idea fraught with immense biological complexity. You cannot simply mix 3 live weakened viruses together in a vial and hope for the best. The immune system is a sophisticated and competitive arena. One virus might provoke such a strong response that it overshadows the others, leaving the child protected from one disease but vulnerable to 2. This phenomenon, known as viral interference, was the central problem Hillerman had to solve. The combination had to be a perfectly balanced biological treaty, a carefully negotiated piece in a syringe, where each attenuated virus was given just enough strength to trigger a lasting immunity without suppressing its neighbors. The story of how he assembled the components for his masterwork began, as it so often did for Hillerman, with his own family. In 1963, his 5-year-old daughter, Gerald Lynn, woke up in the middle of the night with the telltale swollen glands of mumps. Hillerman, the ever-practical scientist, did what any father would do. He comforted his daughter, and then he drove to his lab, grabbed some cotton swabs, drove back home, and swabbed the inside of her throat, collecting the virus that was making her miserable. That sample taken from his own child became the foundation for the Gerald Lynn strain of the mumps vaccine, a version so effective and safe, it is still the gold standard used across the world today. He had his second component, the first, of course, was the measles vaccine building upon the work of Enders and Peebles, and the third was for a disease that, while often milder, carried its own unique and terrible threat, rubella or German measles. A rubella infection in a pregnant woman could lead to catastrophic birth defects in her child, deafness, blindness, heart problems, and profound intellectual disability. The rubella pandemic of 1964-65 in the United States alone resulted in thousands of children born with what was known as congenital rubella syndrome. Hillerman and his team at Merck developed a more powerful and stable rubella vaccine. Now he had the 3 pieces: measles, mumps, and rubella. The work that followed was a masterpiece of careful, methodical science, a delicate dance of attenuation. Each virus was weakened or attenuated by passing it through different cell cultures. The measles and mumps components through chick embryo cells, the rubella through human diploid cells. It was like training a wild animal generation by generation to become tame. Each passage tamed the virus a little more until it was no longer strong enough to cause disease, but still recognizable enough to teach the immune system how to fight the real thing. Hillerman's team experimented endlessly with the dosage and combination, finding that perfect harmonious balance where all three viruses could coexist and perform their educational duty without interfering with one another. After years of this meticulous, unglamorous work, they succeeded. In 1971, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, the MMR, was licensed for use. Its impact was immediate and profound. From a parent's perspective, it was a miracle of convenience. One appointment, one shot, and their child was protected from three of the most common and dangerous threats of childhood. For public health officials, it was a logistical dream. It dramatically simplified vaccination schedules, reduced the number of required clinical visits, and as a direct result, increased immunization coverage. It was easier to get parents to bring their children in for one appointment than for 3 or 4. Compliance rates soared. The MMR wasn't just a new vaccine. It was a new delivery system, a new philosophy. It turned vaccination from a series of hurdles into a single manageable step. Cases of all three diseases plummeted in the countries that adopted it. The terrible birth defects of congenital rubella syndrome became a medical rarity. The mumps-induced deafness and sterility that had afflicted so many vanished from the pediatric wards and measles. The captain of the Men of Death was put on a path toward elimination in the developed world. Maurice Hillerman, the gruff farmer's son from Montana, had not only tamed 3 ancient plagues, he had packaged their defeat into a single, elegant, and profoundly effective shot. He had solved the problem of human nature by making the right choice the easy choice. The deep success of the MMR vaccine in North America and Europe cast a long and troubling shadow over the rest of the world. By the end of the 20th century, a stark, almost cruel division had emerged. In wealthy nations, measles had become a memory, a story grandparents told about a rash and a few days in bed. A generation of parents had grown up without ever seeing it, without knowing its face or its power. But in much of Africa, Asia, and parts of South America, measles was not a memory. It was an ever-present reality, a seasonal predator that still claimed the lives of nearly 1 million children every year. It was the leading vaccine-preventable killer of children on the planet. The world possessed a perfect tool to stop this slaughter, a safe, effective, and inexpensive vaccine. Yet the logistical gap between having the tool and delivering it seemed impossibly wide. It was a failure not of science, but of will, of infrastructure, and of equity. This glaring disparity spurred one of the most ambitious public health undertakings in human history. In 2001, a powerful coalition of global health organizations came together to say simply enough. The American Red Cross, the United Nations Foundation, the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, UNICEF, and the World Health Organization formed what was then called the Measles Initiative, now the Measles and Rubella Initiative. Their goal was bold: to cut global measles deaths by half in just 4 years. It was a declaration of war on a scale never before seen, targeting a single virus across dozens of countries and diverse cultures. A campaign waged not with armies and weapons, but with cold boxes, syringes, and armies of dedicated health workers. The strategy they developed was a simple, elegant, 3-part model. Catch up, keep up, follow up. It was a recognition that you couldn't just fix the future. You first had to address the present. The first phase, catch up, was a massive sweeping frontal assault. In country after country, massive vaccination campaigns were launched to immunize every single child in a wide age range, typically from 9 months to 15 years old, regardless of their previous vaccination history. This was designed to rapidly close the immunity gap, to instantly eliminate the vast reservoir of vulnerable children in which the virus thrived. The sheer scale of these campaigns is difficult to comprehend. Imagine arriving in a small remote village in rural Ethiopia or on the floodplains of Bangladesh. A team of health workers, often local people trained for this purpose, sets up a temporary post under a tree in a schoolhouse at a market. For days, they vaccinate hundreds, sometimes thousands of children. They carry with them the cold chain, a series of insulated boxes and ice packs, a fragile, unbroken chain of refrigeration stretching from a factory in Europe or India across oceans and continents, down bumpy dirt roads to this single vital outpost. If that chain breaks, if the vaccines get too warm, they become useless. Multiply this scene by tens of thousands across the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. In the first 5 years of the initiative, Over 200 million children were vaccinated in these catch-up campaigns. But this shock and awe tactic was only the beginning. The second, and far more difficult part of the strategy was keep up. This was the slow, unglamorous work of building a permanent defense. The goal was to strengthen routine immunization services so that every infant born would receive their measles vaccine as a normal part of their healthcare, usually around their first birthday. This meant training local nurses, ensuring a steady supply of vaccines to rural clinics, establishing reliable health records, and educating communities about the importance of routine shots. It meant building a lasting public health infrastructure where none had existed before. This was not a campaign, it was a nation-building exercise, one clinic and one vial at a time. The final piece of the puzzle was follow-up. The architects of the initiative were realists. They knew that no matter how good the catch-up campaigns were, and no matter how much the keep-up systems improved, children would inevitably be missed. A family might be traveling during the campaign. A village might be cut off by floods. A clinic might run out of supplies. So every 2 to 4 years, follow-up campaigns were conducted to sweep through and vaccinate the children who had been born since the last major push and had missed their routine dose. This three-pronged strategy created a net, catching the vast majority in the big campaigns, and then using the smaller, more nimble systems to catch those who slip through. The results were stunning. The initial goal of halving measles deaths was not just met, it was shattered. Between the year 2000 and 2007, global measles deaths fell by a staggering 74%. In some of the hardest hit regions like Africa, the drop was closer to 90%. Hundreds of thousands of children were alive who would have otherwise perished. It was an almost unbelievable triumph of global cooperation and logistical prowess. But the fight was far from over. The virus, as it always does, proved to be a stubborn and resourceful enemy. It retreated not into oblivion, but into the world's most difficult places, into conflict zones where health workers could not safely travel, into communities fractured by political instability, into regions with such weak infrastructure that the cold chain was a fantasy. In places like Afghanistan, Somalia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, measles persisted, sparking devastating outbreaks among children already weakened by malnutrition and other diseases. The final miles of this marathon would be the hardest. The global initiative had proven that measles could be beaten. It had turned 1 million deaths a year into a fraction of that. But it also revealed a hard truth. A virus doesn't care about national borders or ceasefire agreements. And as long as it has a place to hide, as long as there is a single unvaccinated community, it will wait patiently for its chance to return. The global war on measles was fought on a grand scale. A story of statistics in the millions and logistics spanning continents. It was a story of victories measured in death graphs and immunization coverage charts. This grand narrative, however, often obscured a darker, more intimate, and far more terrifying truth about the nature of the measles virus itself. For the vast majority of children who got it, the illness was a finite, if miserable affair, a week of fever, a rash, a cough, and then for the lucky ones who survived without complications like pneumonia or encephalitis, a full recovery and lifelong immunity. The battle was fought and won in a matter of days. But for a vanishingly small and exquisitely unlucky percentage of those survivors, the virus did not truly leave. It merely retreated, laying dormant within the safest fortress in the entire human body, the central nervous system. There it would wait, sometimes for 5 years, sometimes 10, sometimes even longer, biding its time. And when it finally re-emerged, it did so not as an acute illness, but as a slow, unstoppable, and universally fatal demolition of the mind. This horrifying postscript to a seemingly ordinary childhood disease is known as subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, or SSPE. SSPE is one of medicine's cruelest and most tragic conditions. It is not a reinfection, nor is it a simple complication. It is a persistent, slow-burning infection caused by a defective measles virus that has managed to integrate itself into the brain cells of its host. The virus that sets up this secret residence is mutated. It lacks the ability to properly assemble new viral particles and burst out of the cells to spread through the body. Instead, it spreads slowly, sneakily from one brain cell directly to its neighbor, moving through the neural pathways like a ghost, all while evading the body's immune system, which cannot detect the enemy hiding within its own command center. For years, the child who survived measles appears perfectly healthy. They go to school. They play with friends. They grow. The memory of their childhood sickness fades into a harmless story. Then, with no warning, the decline begins. The onset is almost always subtle, easily mistaken for something else. It often begins as a minor personality change. A once bright and cheerful child becomes withdrawn, irritable, or apathetic. Their performance in school, once excellent, begins to slip. They might seem clumsier than usual, tripping over their own feet, dropping things. A teacher might note their difficulty with concentration. The parents naturally might attribute this to a difficult phase of growing up, to stress at school, or to any number of mundane childhood troubles. But the changes do not stop. They worsen slowly and methodically. This is the first stage of SSPE, the sneaky intellectual and behavioral decay. The second stage is where the horrifying nature of the disease becomes unmistakable. The child begins to experience myoclonic jerks, sudden violent involuntary spasms of the muscles. It might start as a simple head nod, but it progresses until the child's entire body is racked by these seizures, often causing them to collapse without warning. As the defective virus continues its quiet, relentless march through the brain, it destroys everything in its path. The child begins to lose fundamental abilities. They lose the ability to walk. They lose the ability to speak, their words slurring and then disappearing altogether. They lose the ability to feed or dress themselves. The person they were, the child their parents knew, is systematically erased neuron by neuron. Their mental function dissolves, leaving them confused, then unresponsive. The intellectual decline accelerates into a free fall, leaving behind a body that is still living, but a mind that is effectively gone. From there, the disease progresses into its third and fourth stages. The seizures may lessen as the brain damage becomes all-encompassing. The child's body becomes rigid, their limbs locked in unnatural positions. They descend into a vegetative state and eventually a coma. All the while, the body's automatic functions, the heartbeat, the breathing, continue, maintained by the lower brainstem, which is the last part of the central nervous system to be consumed by the disease. The end comes inevitably from secondary complications like pneumonia or heart failure. From the first subtle symptom to the final breath, the process can take 1 to 3 years, though some have lingered longer. It is a slow-motion brain execution. And the most terrifying part of all is that there is no treatment. There is no cure. Once the symptoms of SSPE begin, its course is absolute, and its outcome is always without exception death. SSPE is rare. The risk is estimated to be somewhere around 1 in 10,000 cases of natural measles, though some studies suggest it is much higher for infants who get the disease before their first birthday. But its rarity does nothing to diminish its horror. In fact, it amplifies it. SSPE serves as the ultimate unanswerable rebuttal to the dangerous myth of measles as a benign rite of passage. It is the ghost at the feast of natural immunity. The rash, the fever, the cough, these are merely the virus's opening act. Its true potential for devastation is far greater, a silent ticking time bomb left behind in a handful of its victims. And this is where the quiet preventative power of Hillerman's triple shot reveals its true significance. The MMR vaccine does not just prevent the acute illness. It doesn't just prevent the pneumonia, the encephalitis, the deafness. It prevents this. It ensures that the defective virus never gets a chance to establish its deadly hidden fortress in the brain. Every single dose administered is not just a shield against a week of sickness. It is an exorcism casting out the possibility of a decade-long brain nightmare before it can ever begin. The greatest victories in medicine are not the dramatic cures, but the silent, invisible preventions. They are the tragedies that never happen, the slow descents into darkness that are stopped by a single routine shot in the arm. SSPE is the horror story that modern vaccination has allowed most of us, thankfully, to never have to read. The work of Maurice Hillerman and John Enders had given humanity a miracle, a shield against one of its oldest and most reliable childhood killers. By the late 90s, in the comfortable developed corners of the world, that shield had become invisible. It was simply part of the background hum of modern life, as unremarkable as clean water or a paved road. The MMR vaccine protecting against measles, mumps, and rubella was given to toddlers with the same routine certainty as a first haircut. The terror of the rash, the darkened rooms, the feverish cries, the tiny graves, all of it had faded from living memory. It had become a ghost story, a chapter from a history book that felt securely closed. Measles, for all intents and purposes, was a solved problem. And in the quiet vacuum of that victory, in the fertile soil of that complacency, a new kind of sickness was about to take root. It began not in a crowded slum or a war-torn village, but in a prestigious London hospital at a carefully staged press conference in February of 1998. The man at the centre of it was a gastroenterologist named Andrew Wakefield. He was polished, confident, and possessed the one quality that can make a dangerous idea irresistible. He sounded like he cared. He spoke with the conviction of a lone truth-teller standing up to a monolithic establishment. And he had a story to tell. It was a story published in one of the world's most respected medical journals, The Lancet. The paper was a case series, a study of just 12 children. 12, not 12,000 or even 1,200. A dozen children who, according to Wakefield, shared a unique and terrifying story. Their parents reported that these children had been developing normally, but then, shortly after receiving their MMR vaccine, they had suffered from both chronic bowel problems and a sudden, devastating regression into autism. Wakefield claimed to have discovered a new syndrome, a unique form of autistic enterocolitis, and he pointed his finger squarely at the measles component of the MMR shot. At the press conference, he didn't just present his findings, he gave advice. He suggested with an air of grave responsibility that parents should opt for single-dose vaccines instead of the combined MMR. It was a recommendation that would echo around the world. A single stone tossed into a placid lake with ripples that would spread for decades. The problem was the stone was a fraud. The entire story was a carefully constructed deception. Behind the scenes, Wakefield's research was not the noble pursuit of truth it appeared to be. He was at the time being paid more than $400,000 by a British lawyer named Richard Barr. Barr's agenda was not scientific. He was actively recruiting plaintiffs for a lawsuit against the manufacturers of the MMR vaccine. Wakefield's job was to provide the medical evidence, the smoking gun, to make that lawsuit viable. The 12 children in his study were not a random sample. They were handpicked from families already involved in the legal campaign. This was not a conflict of interest. It was the entire point of the exercise, and that was only the beginning of the rot. The science itself was a catastrophe. A study of 12 children with no control group is in epidemiological terms barely an anecdote. It cannot prove causation any more than noticing that 12 people who developed a headache had all eaten toast for breakfast proves that toast causes headaches. But Wakefield didn't just rely on flimsy methodology. He actively falsified his data. Investigative journalist Brian Deere would later spend years painstakingly cross-referencing the claims in the Lancet paper with the children's actual medical records. He found a trail of breathtaking dishonesty. Children who had developmental concerns noted by doctors long before their MMR shots were presented in the paper as having been previously normal. The timeline of symptom onset was manipulated to fit the desired narrative, moving the first signs of autism closer to the date of vaccination. The new bowel disease Wakefield claimed to have discovered was in many cases just normal intestinal tissue, its appearance misinterpreted or deliberately misreported by the pathologist on Wakefield's team. Worse still was the treatment of the children themselves. In his quest for evidence, Wakefield subjected these vulnerable children to a battery of invasive, painful, and medically unnecessary procedures. Lumbar punctures, colonoscopies, MRIs, all performed without proper ethical clearance and justified by a hypothesis he was being paid to invent. It was a profound betrayal of his duty as a physician, a violation of the sacred trust between doctor and patient, all in service of a legal strategy and personal profit. Before the Lancet paper was even published, Wakefield had filed a patent for his own single-shot measles vaccine, a product that would stand to make him a fortune if public faith in the combined MMR vaccine could be successfully destroyed. But the public knew none of this. They saw a concerned doctor on their television screens, a dramatic headline in their morning paper. The media, hungry for a compelling controversy, amplified the story with breathless enthusiasm. The narrative was perfect, a brave maverick versus a faceless pharmaceutical industry. The fear of autism, a complex and poorly understood condition, was a powerful emotional driver. It was far easier to grasp a simple villainous explanation like a vaccine than to accept the bewildering uncertainties of genetics and neurology. The sober, measured responses from the global scientific community were drowned out. They spoke in the dry language of epidemiology, of large-scale studies of statistical significance. They explained that multiple massive studies involving millions of children had already been conducted and had found no link whatsoever. between the MMR vaccine and autism, but their press releases and academic papers could not compete with the visceral image of a crying mother and a doctor offering a simple, terrible answer. The lie was simple and emotional. The truth was complex and statistical. In the court of public opinion, the truth never stood a chance. The seed of doubt had been planted, and the modern anti-vaccination movement, a ghost haunting the halls of medical progress, had been given its founding myth, its sacred text, and its first martyr. The childhood plague, once on the verge of being forgotten, was quietly preparing for its return. The fallout from that London press conference was not immediate. It was a slow-motion catastrophe, a contagion of fear that spread from household to household, from playground to playground, and then across oceans. The idea, once released, was far more infectious than the virus it purported to expose. In the United Kingdom, the first and most immediate victim of the fraud, MMR vaccination rates began to slide. They dipped from a safe and robust 92% in the mid-90s to a dangerous 80% by 2004. In some pockets of London, the rate fell below 60%. It was a slow collective dismantling of a public health triumph, one worried parent at a time. Each decision made out of love and fear seemed small and personal. But in aggregate, they were tearing gaping holes in the invisible shield of herd immunity. Herd immunity is one of the most beautiful and most fragile concepts in public health. It is a silent communal promise. When a high enough percentage of a population is vaccinated, it creates a firewall that protects everyone, especially the most vulnerable. It shields the newborn infant too young for her first dose of MMR. It shields the chemotherapy patient whose immune system has been burned away. It shields the elderly and the organ transplant recipient. They're kept safe not by their own immunity, but by the immunity of the community that surrounds them. But the firewall is only as strong as its weakest point. When vaccination rates fall, sparks of the old disease can jump across the gaps. And measles, with its ferocious infectivity, is a fire that needs only the smallest opening to become an inferno. The first major blaze ignited in Dublin, Ireland in the year 2000. Fueled by the Wakefield scare, immunization rates had tumbled. The result was a devastating measles outbreak. More than 1,500 cases, over 100 hospitalizations for complications like severe pneumonia, and tragically the deaths of 3 children. It was a stark, brutal reminder of what the disease actually was. Stripped of all theory and debate, it was not a benign rash. It was a killer. The United Kingdom soon followed. After officially eliminating endemic measles transmission, the country began to see a shocking resurgence. Between 2012 and 2013, a major outbreak centred in Swansea, Wales saw over 1,200 people fall ill with dozens requiring hospital care. It was the direct, predictable consequence of a generation of children whose parents had been persuaded to refuse or delay the MMR vaccine a decade earlier. The ghost had returned to its old hunting grounds, but the fear and the virus that followed it did not respect national borders. Wakefield's discredited ideas, amplified by the nascent power of the internet, became a global export. He was stripped of his medical license in the UK in 2010. His paper formally retracted by The Lancet as an utter fraud. But it didn't matter. In the United States, he was welcomed not as a charlatan, but as a persecuted hero. He found a receptive audience among celebrities and wellness gurus, and his message spread through forums, blogs, and then with explosive force, social media. The consequences were written in the public health records of town after town. In 2014, the perfect symbol of this regression occurred in the most ironic of places, Disneyland. The happiest place on Earth became the center of a multi-state measles outbreak. A single infectious tourist, likely from a country where measles was still common, mingled with crowds containing a critical number of unvaccinated individuals. From that one spark, the virus spread across California and to 6 other states, infecting 147 people. The United States had officially declared measles eliminated in the year 2000. It was a landmark achievement. Now here it was again, spreading through a theme park, a testament to how quickly a victory could be undone. The story took an even darker and more specific turn in 2017 in Minnesota. Wakefield and his allies had specifically targeted the state's large Somali American immigrant community. They held meetings, spread pamphlets, and stirred fears that this community's children were uniquely susceptible to vaccine injury. They preyed upon a group already facing challenges with language barriers and navigating a complex healthcare system. Exploiting their legitimate concerns about high rates of autism in their community, The campaign of misinformation was brutally effective. MMR vaccination rates among Somali American toddlers in Minnesota plummeted from over 90% to just over 40%. The result was the state's worst measles outbreak in decades. 75 people, mostly unvaccinated Somali American children, got the disease. More than 20 of them ended up in the hospital. It was a calculated, almost laboratory-perfect demonstration of the real-world impact of the Wakefield lie. Target a community with misinformation, destroy their confidence in vaccination, and watch the disease come roaring back. But the most catastrophic illustration of this new reality occurred half a world away on the small Pacific island nation of Samoa in 2019. It was the ultimate tragic endgame of the Wakefield fraud. A year prior, a terrible medical accident. 2 infants had died after nurses incorrectly mixed the MMR vaccine with a muscle relaxant instead of sterile water, had shattered public trust. Anti-vaccine groups from Australia, New Zealand, and the United States flooded the island's social media with propaganda, blaming the vaccine itself and feeding the flames of fear. The government temporarily suspended its MMR program. By the time it was restarted, the damage was done. The population was terrified. Vaccination coverage collapsed to a catastrophic 31%. In October 2019, measles arrived. In a population with virtually no herd immunity, the virus moved with terrifying speed and efficiency. It was like a firestorm in a bone-dry forest. The government declared a state of emergency. Schools were closed. Public gatherings were banned. In a desperate attempt to rush vaccinations to the unprotected, officials asked families with unvaccinated members to hang a red cloth or a red flag outside their homes so mobile medical teams could find them. The islands became dotted with these small crimson signals of vulnerability. But it was too late for so many. The hospitals were overwhelmed with sick and dying children. The final toll was heartbreaking. Over 5,700 cases in a country of just 200,000 people and 83 deaths. 72 of them were children under the age of 5. 83 deaths from a completely preventable disease. A tragedy born directly from a lie concocted 20 years earlier in a London office for money. The return of the conquered disease was complete, and it was just as merciless as it had ever been. And so we find ourselves in the 21st century, fighting a war we thought that we had already won. The battle against measles now unfolds on 2 very different but deeply connected fronts. It is an unfinished war, a constant quiet struggle against both a biological virus and a viral idea. On one front, the fight is a familiar one, a continuation of the great public health crusade of the 20th century. It is a logistical war fought in the world's most remote and underserved communities. It's the battle of the cold chain, the immense operational challenge of keeping millions of vaccine doses at a precise cool temperature as they travel by plane, by jeep, by motorbike, and finally, on foot, to reach a child in a dusty village in sub-Saharan Africa, or a makeshift clinic in a refugee camp in Bangladesh. This is the heroic, grinding work of organizations like the World Health Organization, UNICEF and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. They are the heirs to John, Enders and Maurice Hilleman fighting the virus, on its home turf in places where healthcare infrastructure is fragile and political instability is a constant threat. In 2019, the year of the Samoa tragedy, there were still over 140,000 measles deaths globally, the vast majority of them children in the developing world. For them, the threat isn't a fraudulent paper from 1998. It's the simple, brutal lack of access to a life-saving shot. This is a war of resources, of political will, of pushing back against the immense friction of poverty and conflict to deliver a small vial of hope. The second front is stranger, more sneaky, and in many ways more difficult to fight. This battle is not waged in clinics, but online. It's a war against misinformation, fought on social media feeds, in private messaging groups, and in the comment sections of YouTube videos. The enemy here is not the Rubiola virus, but the architecture of the modern internet itself, an ecosystem that seems precision-engineered to spread fear and mistrust. The same algorithms that can recommend a new song or a pair of shoes can also guide a worried new parent down a rabbit hole of anti-vaccine propaganda. Frightening anecdotes and slickly produced videos, regardless of their truthfulness, are often more engaging and therefore more readily amplified than a dense and sober report from the Centers for Disease Control. On this battlefield, Andrew Wakefield's lie, long since debunked and retracted, continues to thrive, mutating and evolving with each share and repost. He was struck off the medical register. His career in mainstream science a ruin, but in the digital world he achieved a kind of immortality. This digital war is difficult because it's not about data, it's about trust. The Wakefield fraud was a deliberate act of sabotage against the very foundation of public health, the trust between patients and doctors, between citizens and scientific institutions. The movement he spawned thrives on nurturing that suspicion. It frames public health officials as corporate shills, doctors as ignorant pawns, and the entire scientific consensus as a vast conspiracy. Rebuilding that trust is a slow, painstaking process. It requires doctors to have longer, more empathetic conversations with hesitant parents. It requires scientists to become better communicators, to step out of the lab and into the public square. It requires all of us to become more critical consumers of information, to learn how to distinguish between a credible source and a compelling falsehood. The complete history of measles, from the ancient physicians who first described it to the modern-day coders, who write the algorithms that spread lies about it, holds within it the entire story of vaccination. We have seen the world before the shield, a world where the disease was an unavoidable, often lethal rite of passage. We have seen the breathtaking triumph of its creation, a testament to human ingenuity and persistence that saved and continues to save hundreds of millions of lives. And now we have seen what happens when we falter, when we allow fear to eclipse reason and forget the lessons of the past. The resurgence of measles in wealthy nations that had long forgotten it is a profound and humbling lesson. It teaches us that complacency is the most dangerous side effect of success. When a vaccine works so well that it makes a disease disappear, we forget to fear the disease. And in that absence of fear, we create space to begin fearing the vaccine itself. The war against measles is not over. It never will be. It is a permanent state of vigilance. The virus is patient. It will always be there, waiting in the reservoir of the unvaccinated, looking for a crack in our collective defenses for a moment of doubt, for a decline in trust. The story of measles is a stark reminder that the victories of science are not permanent. They are not monuments of stone. They are fragile gardens that must be constantly tended. They must be defended not only with syringes and refrigeration, but with education, with empathy, with clear communication, and most importantly, with memory. We must remember the darkened rooms. We must remember the devastating coughs. We must remember the small graves because measles has not forgotten them, and if we ever allow ourselves to, it will be more than ready to remind us.